Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another edition of History and Truth. Today we are once again in Ogimon Tea Room, which is a 250-year-old cafe. And we're once again drinking coffee and tea from 250-year-old teacups. Today we are focusing on the Nova Scotian forts. First part we're going to do are the mainland Nova Scotia forts. And there are lots of them. This is from the government site. Nova Scotia, along with present-day New Brunswick and most of Maine, was formerly known by the French as Acadia until British control in 1713. Actually, de facto by 1710. Nova Scotia was first named as such in a 1621 grant by King James I of England. Nova Scotia literally means in Latin, New Scotland. First place, Fort Franklin was built in 1768 in Tatamagouche, here. It was a briefly occupied British blockhouse on the supply route from Halifax to Charlottetown via the Cobequid Onslow Road. It was protected by a moated earthen redoubt to the rear. The troops were removed after a few months to garrison Boston, Massachusetts during civil disturbances. The earthworks are possibly still there, located on Blockhouse Point on the western side of the mouth of the Tatamagouche River. The town was permanently settled by the British in 1770. The earlier Acadian village here was abandoned in August 1755. Pictou Blockhouse. Well, first off, this is what the location looks like now. Next, Pictou Blockhouse, obviously in Pictou. From 1812 to 1815, during the War of 1812, an earthenwork battery and wooden blockhouse, magazine, and guardhouse was built here to defend the town. The exact location is undetermined. When you Google the area, try to Google Maps and Google Images, you won't find it. You'll be instead referred to the old customs house. Melfort Battery, 1939 to 1945 in Melfort. Two 4-inch naval guns were located east of the town to protect the rail barges, the train ferry, carrying coal across the Canso Strait from Port Hawkesbury to Mulgrave. 2 searchlights were also placed here. A 3rd searchlight and a magnetic indicator loop station were located to the east at Eddy Point. Beacon Battery near Olds Cove. Again, this is for 1939 to 1945. It was originally located just south of Olds Cove, relocated north in late 1940 or early 1941 to higher ground towards the Hefferon Point Lighthouse, which is east of Havre-Boucher, to improve the field of fire. 2 4-inch naval guns and an 18-pounder field gun were located here. The magazine and 2 gun blocks of both naval guns and an 18-pounder field gun were located here. The magazine and 2 gun blocks of both sites still exist. The second site is on private property. A private residence at the second site stands where the barracks were once located. 2 searchlights and a magnetic indicator loop station were also located nearby. This post usually operated only in the summer months, as the strait froze up during the winter. The gun crew was transferred to Battery Wolf in Louisbourg for the winter months. Note the Canso Causeway between Port Hastings and Olds Cove was built in 1955. During World War I, August 1914 to November 1915, an improvised timber blockhouse as a lookout was located near Olds Cove. One 4.7-inch field gun may have been located here. This is possibly the Canso Battery below. Okay, Mulgrave Camp. The main cantonment, this is also 1940 to 1945 in Mulgrave. The main cantonment area for the coast artillery and infantry units guarding the Canso Strait was located at McNair's Point on the north side of the railroad, 2 miles north of the town. Machine gun nests were located here and at Point Tupper across the strait. The Canso Battery. We'll move a little bit further along the coast from the crossing to Canso. 1914 to 1917 in Canso. During World War I, August 1914 to November 1915, 2 improvised timber blockhouses as lookouts were located east and west of Hazel Hill. 2 4.7-inch field guns were emplaced at undetermined locations, one or both probably near Canso. One gun was removed in March 1915, the other removed in November 1915. In October 1916, one 4.7-inch field gun was re-emplaced in the area at an undetermined location, but once again removed in May 1917 to Fort Petrie, near Sydney. Fort St. Francois, from 1636 and 1659 to 1718 in Guysborough. Guysborough is once again around here. A French fortified trading post once located here, originally built by Isaac de Razilly in 1636, later rebuilt by Nicholas Denis in 1659. It was later rebuilt several times. Also known as Chedabucto Fort, the settlement was attacked and destroyed by the British in September 1718. The Guysborough Blockhouse. Once again, this is what a blockhouse looks like. 1812 to 1815. A blockhouse and gun battery was built here to defend the town's harbor, probably the same post as Manchester Blockhouse, as 1812 to 1815 in Manchester. During the War of 1812, an earthenwork battery with a wooden blockhouse, magazine, and guardhouse was built here to defend the town. Guysborough Blockhouse and Manchester Blockhouse are probably the same blockhouse. Canso, 1640 in Canso. There was an early French summer fishing settlement, which is possibly fortified. Now, Fort William Augustus. Canso Islands and Grassy Island Fort National Historic Site. 1720 to 1745 on Grassy Island. This was located offshore from Canso. There were earthenwork ruins of a British 4-point star-shaped fort on the hill overlooking the spit. Here's the spit. Also known as Grassy Island Fort. British militia troops of the 40th Regiment of Foot were first garrisoned here in 1720 at Fort Phillips. Fort Phillips is out here on the spit, on the western spit. Point to note with these fellows, this was a miserable place to be stuck, and they were issued with muskets whose flints were iffy if they worked at all, which was a terrible idea for what was eventually going to happen to them in the battle for Fort William Augustus. So the Fort Phillips was expanded and renamed in 1723. A timber blockhouse was built in 1735. It was attacked and burned by the French in May 1744. It was also attacked in 1723. Another blockhouse was later built here in April-May 1745 by William Pepperell, supporting the siege against Louisbourg. It was abandoned later that year. Free public access by boat from the Canso Islands, Nova Scotia Service Visitor Center. The small garrison here, which is only maybe 78 men, were attacked in the 1720s by 350 French Marines and over 900 Acadian and Mi'kmaq warriors. The Mi'kmaq and the Acadians had better muskets with better flints than the tiny garrison of the fort. These guys didn't stand much of a chance. Now that's the government's listing of it. Now we're going to look at Wikipedia's listing for Canso. For Wikipedia, Fort William Augustus, also known as Grassy Island Fort, Fort Phillips, was a British fort built on Grassy Island off Canso, Nova Scotia, during the lead-up to Father Rale's War in 1720. In the wake of the Squirrel Affair and the British attack on Fort St. Louis at present-day Guysborough, Cyprian Southack urged Governor Richard Phillips to build a fort. The fort was named after Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, a son of George II of Great Britain. In 1720, the New Englanders began to construct Fort William Augustus, also known as Fort Phillips, after the governor of Nova Scotia, Richard Phillips. Erection of a permanent facility was a violation of long-standing agreements between the Mi'kmaq and British Americans. The significant violation helped precipitate Father Rale's War 2 years later. Once again, the Treaty of Utrecht gave mainland Nova Scotia over to British control, or early Anglophone Nova Scotians, so they could build wherever they want. This was not a violation. On 7th August 1720, a party of 60 to 70 Mi'kmaq joined French fishermen from Petit de Gras in an attack on Fort Phillips as it was being built. The Mi'kmaq killed 3 men, wounded 4, and caused significant damage. The New Englanders took 21 prisoners, which they transported to Annapolis Royal. This raid on Canso was significant because of the involvement of the Mi'kmaq and further contribution to Father Rale's War. In 1721, the governor of the province of Massachusetts took proprietorial attitude towards the Canso fisheries and sent HMS Seahorse to patrol the waters off Nova Scotia. With the arrival of British troops, the Mi'kmaq were discouraged from attacking until the following year. The HMS Seahorse was replaced in 1721 by a New England vessel, William Augustus, under the command of Southack. Father Rale's War began in 25th July 1722 and lasted through 15th December 1725. On 23rd July 1723, the village was raided again by the Mi'kmaq, who killed 3 men, a woman, and a child. The New Englanders promptly built a 12-gun blockhouse to guard the village and fishery in response. So there was a blockhouse in the town as well. In 1725, 60 Abenakis and Mi'kmaq launched another attack on Canso, destroying 2 houses and killing 6 people. King George's War. Edward Howe constructed a blockhouse and rebuilt other structures in the 1730s. The French and Mi'kmaq destroyed the fort in the raid on Canso during King George's War in 1744. The area was used to stage the siege of Louisbourg in 1745. A blockhouse was built, which they named Fort Prince William in Nova Scotia. Now, once again, this attack was overwhelming. There were only possibly 70 or 80 rather sick soldiers with faulty muskets. There were 350 French Marines and over 900 Mi'kmaq and Acadians in this attack. Grassy Island Fort, National Historic Site of Canada. Grassy Island Fort was recognized as a National Historic Site of Canada in 1962. There are remains of the 1720 redoubt, the 1723-24 fort, and the 1735 blockhouse. Moving along the coast, Here's another point of interest. This is a monument to a 13th century visit by the Templars, supposedly. Sinclair landed here, supposedly. Sable Island Fort. We're back to the government stuff. Sable Island Fort and Sable Island National Park Reserve. Cape Sable Island and Sable Island are completely different. Cape Sable is a little island off the tip of the bottom of Nova Scotia, here. But Sable Island is out here. So Cape Sable Island and Sable Island are different places. Sable Island National Park Reserve. 1598 to 1602 on Sable Island, there was an early French settlement made by 40 colonists under the Marquis de la Roche. Crude houses and a storehouse were built, probably with defensive earthworks. In 1601 or 1602, the colonists mutinied, killing the commander and several others. The 11 destitute survivors were found and rescued in 1603. Sable Island was then, and still is, sandy and treeless, accessed only by special government permission through Environment Canada. Lawrencetown Fort. Halifax is up here. Lawrencetown is over here along the coast, along the eastern coast, near Halifax. If you look on the map, it's going up here. Lawrencetown Fort from 1754 to 1757 in Lawrencetown, Halifax County, not to be confused with a different Lawrencetown in another part of Nova Scotia. A blockhouse and stockade defended this failed early settlement. The town would be resettled much later. This fort, when it was settled, was attacked so many times by the Mi'kmaq and Acadians that the fort was abandoned. The guys couldn't come out to farm and feed themselves. Chester Blockhouse. Here is Chester. Here's Halifax. Chester. There's Lunenburg here. Chester is in between. 1759 to 1814 in Chester. A militia blockhouse was located on Blockhouse Hill on Duke Street. Attacked by American privateers in July 1782, the women of the town had paraded around the blockhouse with red capes and broomsticks, imitating the local militia and fooling the Americans into backing off. It seemed like there was many more soldiers there than there actually was. This event is recreated annually at the Wisteria Cottage House. 2 of the original 24-pounder guns are now on display since 1961 at the Royal Canadian Legion Hall at Union and Duke Streets. Mahone Bay. Mahone Bay is here. Mahone Bay Blockhouse. Here's a better look at Mahone Bay. 1754, there was a timber blockhouse that was built here under Captain Ephraim Cook to protect German and Swiss Protestant settlers. Information at the Settlers Museum on Main Street. And note, this post may have been located at the present community of Blockhouse, just to the west of the junction of highways 324 and 325. It is reported that an old blockhouse here was burned down in 1874. So this would be here. Lunenburg blockhouses. We already talked about Lunenburg before. Once again, here's a very old map of Lunenburg. The blockhouses would have also cut off the tip of Lunenburg to give a secure location for the settlers. Here is an image of one of the blockhouses. Here's the War of 1812 blockhouse in that location. Here, once again, is Blockhouse Hill. And once again, here is where my Aunt Nina and Uncle Pete used to live. Okay? Here is the remains of the fortification from the first fortified periods, and a cannon from 1848. Several blockhouses were erected here to protect the harbor over the years. At least two were built on the peninsula in 1753. Several were located behind to the west of the town in 1756. One with a 6-gun battery was built on Windmill Hill in 1812. Another with a 4-gun battery was built on Jesser's Point in 1813. Blockhouse Hill has existent earthworks from the 1812 era and an 1848 cannon on display. This one once again. American privateers attacked the town in July 1782, capturing and burning the blockhouse on Blockhouse Hill. The Old Town District was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995. The town's new Visitor Information Center is located in a replica blockhouse on Blockhouse Hill. Once again, that's this one. The Nova Scotia colonial government in 1760 tried to establish a centralized trading post or factory under military control to regulate the region's fur trade. Camp Norway, 1940 to 1943 in Lunenburg. A Royal Norwegian Navy training depot for merchant seamen and whalers who were being taken into the Navy. This was established after Norway had been invaded by Germany, while most of her merchant fleet had been put to sea. For security reasons, its location was simply referred to as somewhere on the east coast of Canada. The camp was officially opened on November 29, 1940, although crews had been arriving since September, and consisted of an 800-man barracks located on a 2-acre site on the south side of the town. Later, there was a mess hall, 2 storage buildings, a garage, and a carpentry shop were added. Many of the original buildings still exist and are owned and occupied by ABCO Industries, and the metal sign over the main gate still proclaims it to be Camp Norway. Norway has compulsory military service, so most of these men had already been through basic training and were listed as reservists. At the same time, merchant ships were being equipped as fast as possible with some armament, usually a 4-inch gun on the stern and pom-poms on the upper superstructure. Trained gunners were obviously needed, and at first the gun crews on Norwegian ships were British Army or Navy. Consequently, Camp Norway took on the additional task of training gunners for the merchant fleet. The camp had a training ship, the Moss, and a variety of weaponry. With the permission of the Canadian authorities, the Norwegians placed 2 75mm guns to cover the entrance to the harbor, and then, at the request of the Canadians, Camp Norway was incorporated into the Canadian Coastal Defense System. The camp lasted until the gunnery school was transferred to Traverse Island, New York, in June 1943. By that time, it had trained about 450 men as crew members for the converted whale ships and other vessels, and 635 gunners for armed merchant ships. Fort St. Mary de Grace National Historic Site from 1632 to 1636. Camp St. Mary de Grace is here. Here would be Fort Anne. This is further down on the French shore, near Metegan. Le Havre, again from 1632 to 1636. Built by Isaac de Razilly, first governor of Acadia, and served as the first capital of Acadia. It is also known as Fort Le Havre. It was abandoned when Port Royal was resettled. The Fort Point Museum, a former lighthouse keeper's house, is located on the site, along with a rock cairn memorial. The Le Havre Blockhouse is from 1812 to 1815 at Le Havre, the same place. During the War of 1812, an earthwork battery with a wooden blockhouse, magazine, and guardhouse was built here to defend the town, probably located at Fort Point. So, the same place. Port Rossignol Post, unknown, near Liverpool. Here is Shelburne. Liverpool's up the coast here. From 1632, unknown, this was a French trading post. Fort Morris at Fort Point Lighthouse Park in Liverpool, here again. Fort Point in Liverpool. Here is a sign to Fort Point explaining its existence. The sign reads, erected at the beginning of the Revolutionary War to guard the port of Sunbury and St. John's Parish. Fort Morris was an enclosed earthwork in the shape of an irregular quadrangle. It is surrounded by a parapet and a moat. It contained a parade of about an acre. The fort was determined by more than 25 pieces of ordnance of various size. It was named in honor of Captain Morris, who commissioned the company of artillery by which it was first garrisoned early in 1726. Colonel John McIntosh commanded the garrison on November 25th, 1778, when Colonel L.W. Fusser, with 500 British ground troops, supported by armed ships in the Medway River, raided at Sunbury and demanded the immediate surrender of Fort Morris. Colonel McIntosh, with 127 Continental troops, Fort militia, and citizens of Sunbury, less than 200 men in all, replied, "Come and take it." The enemy retreated to the south, and Continental troops held Fort Morris until January 9th, 1779, when it was captured by British forces. So the British didn't manage to take it on the first try, but they did take it on the second try. Here's the way up to Fort Point. Here is a model of the fort in the museum there. Once again, this was an American fort in Nova Scotia. Now we'll take a look at what Wikipedia has to say about Fort Point and Fort Morris. Fort Morris, once again, is more or less, Wikipedia says more or less the same thing. Fort Carleton, 1783 to 1791 at Gunning Cove. Where is Gunning Cove? From 1783 to 1791, there was a British fort, was once located at Fort Point, previously Scarborough Point, then renamed Carleton Point when fortified. It was dismantled after less than a decade of use. Shelburne Blockhouse. From 1812 to 1815, here's Shelburne, here's Liverpool. Liverpool, once again, was briefly an American port. Here's Shelburne Blockhouse. 1812 to 1815. Built here during the War of 1812 was an earthenwork battery and a wooden blockhouse, magazine, and guardhouse. The exact location is undetermined. Fort McNutt. This is, once again, in Shelburne Harbor. Shelburne, once again, is here. In the harbor, on an island, was Fort McNutt from 1741 to 1941 to 1944 on McNutt's Island. It's located near the Cape Roseway Lighthouse, built in 1788 and destroyed by fire in 1959. It was rebuilt in 1961, armed with two American-made 10-inch M1888 guns on a M1893 barbette carriages, both of which still remain as rusted relics. Garrisoned by the 104th Coast Artillery Battery, the port of Shelburne was designated as an alternate port to Halifax Harbor during World War II. The island is accessible by ferry from Gunning Cove. Gunning Cove here. So, here, there was a fort on that island in the middle. A subpost, there were two casemated, so the Government Point Battery, 1939 to 1944, south of Jordan Bay, also in that same area. There were two casemated 4.7-inch guns and a searchlight position were located here. The concrete casemates still exist. A subpost of HMCS Shelburne, Royal Canadian Naval Station, CFS Shelburne, after 1968, was later located here from 1955 to 1995, when the base was closed. The T-Chest Battery, 1939 to 1942, south of Sandy Point. A two-gun 75mm AMTB battery was located here near T-Chest Island, then relocated to Sandy Point. And the Sandy Point Battery from 1942 to 1944 at Sandy Point. The AMTB battery from T-Chest was relocated here to better protect the RCAF seaplane base, built here in June 1942. The nearby Sandy Point Lighthouse was built in 1903. Fort St. Louis, 1623 to 1635, at Port Latour. Built by Charles de Saint-Étienne de La Tour and attacked by the British in 1629 and 1630. Charles' father, Claude, was involved in the 1630 attack. Site is marked by a stone cairn, which was put there in 1937. Cannons and other artifacts are on display at the Western Counties Military Museum in Barrington. Note, The fort was rebuilt after the second attack in 1630, and debate exists that may place the actual location of the new fort at Sandy Hills Beach. Fort Lomeron. Before we get to that, this is the plaque for Fort St. Louis. We'll now read what the plaque says. In 1630, Claude de la Tour arrived here with an Anglo-Scottish expedition and strove in vain to induce his son, Charles, to surrender this last foothold of France in Acadia. From the consequent displeasure of the Scots at Port Royal, Charles later offered him refuge near this fort. So that was Fort Lomeron. Centerville, which is nearby. 1630 to 1640 at Centerville, a French trading post, mission at McGray's Cove and Cape Sable Island, built by Charles, once again, Cape Sable Island, Gray's Island. With about, built by Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour. The settlement on Cape Sable Island, with about 42 buildings, was attacked and destroyed, burned, in 1630 by the British. The British very soon after rebuilt the post, renamed Fort Preble as a base to attack Fort St. Louis. They weren't the same locations, but they are very nearby to each other. The Yarmouth Blockhouse. Yarmouth is down here at the bottom. There is a ferry from Yarmouth to Bangor, Maine. It runs only in the summer months. From 1812 to 1815 in Yarmouth. This was located on Bunkers Peninsula with a 4-gun earthwork battery and a wooden blockhouse, magazine, and guardhouse. It was later abandoned. Located in town on the Rock at Rock Cottage Lane was a powder magazine and militia storeroom from 1812 to 1815. More in this area. There was the Yarmouth Battery from the 1940s in Yarmouth. There was one 18-pounder gun was emplaced on the ferry terminal pier that was used during World War II. The old pier from that time no longer exists. And Weymouth Port nearby from 1812, Weymouth North. There is at Fort Point, located at the mouth of the Sissiboo River. The town was established in 1785. Although settlement first began in the 1760s, a blockhouse may have been located here during the War of 1812. The Digby Gut blockhouses. Here's Digby. Annapolis Royal is this way. Digby Gut is this little passage of water connecting the Annapolis Basin to the Bay of Fundy. The Digby Gut blockhouses were on either side of the passage. Small strait in between. 3 blockhouses were built to defend the town. One was on the hill overlooking the town, which is over here. And the other 2 were to the east, Victoria Beach, and the west, Bayview of Digby Gut, here and here. Each with 4-gun batteries. Each battery had 4 guns. They were later abandoned. The earthwork of the Bayview Battery still exists, with 3 old guns from the 1760s era still remaining. This site is owned by Parks Canada, but not generally accessible to the public. The 4th gun, said to be from this battery, is located on the Admiral's Walk in Digby. The 6 cannons displayed in Oilers Park along the boardwalk were manufactured in the 1840s. There were once French plans for a work at present-day Victoria Beach, but it was probably never built. Once again, this is what a blockhouse looks like. Port Royal habitation. Port Royal. Annapolis Royal is here. Port Royal is across the water. Not the same place. It was moved here eventually, but it was originally here. Port Royal habitation, National Historic Site, from 1605 to 1623 at Port Royal. The 1604 French settlement from St. Croix Island, Maine, moved here during the next season for better conditions, because roughly half of all the settlers at St. Croix, Maine, died in that first winter on the island when they chopped down all the trees, and they died of sickness and scurvy. Wasn't a very good location. This is what the replica of Port Royal National Historic Site now looks like. Here is a longer, more stretched out look of the entire location. The 1604 settlement from St. Croix Island and all that. English raiders from Virginia attacked and burned the settlement in November 1613. It was soon rebuilt by Charles de Saint-Étienne de La Tour and his father Claude, both of whom had remained behind with the Indians and lasted until 1623 when attacked again. La Tour then moved to Cape Sable Island. In 1636, the French resumed the settlement at present-day Annapolis Royal, reconstructed in 1939 based on a 1613 drawing by Champlain, but most likely not on the actual site. Fort Charles, National Historic Site. We made a couple of videos at Fort Charles several years ago. 1629 to 1632, Annapolis Royal. This fort is now within the walls, roughly here, in Fort Anne. Two boatloads of Scots settlers and troops, led by William Alexander Jr., built this fort across from the former French fort at Port Royal. They were evicted by the French in 1632 after a series of wars and battles, one at Berlin in Cape Breton. The ruins are buried under Fort Anne's outerworks, also known as Scotch or Scots Fort in historical reference. Now, interesting point to remember here, the settlers at Port Royal left the area and moved to Port La Tour. The settlers of the Scots here at Fort Charles, most of them left, but some of them stayed. So the first permanent Western or European settlers to North America were actually the Scots in this area. Fort Anne National Historic Site. Again, we've already done videos about this. From 1636 to 1797, and from 1812 to 1815 at Annapolis Royal. The French resumed the Port Royal settlement here in 1636 and built a four-bastioned earthworks fort for defense, which is Port Royal Fort, in 1643. This became the new capital of Acadia. Captured by British troops under Major Robert Sedgwick in July 1654, the fort was no longer in use by 1686, and the British easily captured the town in May 1690. It was returned by treaty in 1697. The French rebuilt the fort in 1702 as a square earthenwork with four bastions. This fort still stands today. That's the inside fort. It withstood British attacks in 1704 and in June and August in 1707. Not really British attacks. These are New Englander attacks. The South magazine was built in 1708, the oldest existent detached magazine in colonial British North America. The British captured the fort for a final time in October 1710 and renamed the fort, also named for the settlement, to Annapolis Royal, Fort Anne and Annapolis Royal for Queen Anne. Important to remember, the first two attacks in 1707 were not by British soldiers. They were from people from New England, Massachusetts in particular. The ones that finally took Fort Royal, Annapolis Royal, included 350 British Royal Marines. The French and British had fortified nearby Goat Island, and the Black Hole magazine was built in 1790. The officers' quarters was built in 1797. A wooden blockhouse was built within the remains of Fort Anne in 1812. It was demolished for firewood in 1882. Annapolis Royal served as the capital of the province until 1749, when Halifax was established. This is Canada's oldest national historic site and is indeed the cradle of English Canada. Fort Mohawk. Once again, Fort Mohawk was a blockhouse. From 1712 to 1714 and from 1744 to 1749 in Annapolis Royal. A British blockhouse was originally built for the use of New York Mohawk Indians against the local Mi'kmaq Indians. It was still standing in 1729 when it was used as a chapel. The blockhouse was rebuilt by John Gorham's Rangers, also Mohawk Indians from New York, in 1744 near the original location. The garrison transferred to Halifax, then to Fort Sackville in 1749. The blockhouse was transported to Minas, which means Fort Vaux-Logis, in 1749. A monument is located near the end of Lower St. George Street. Okay, so here is a map of Annapolis Royal. Here is Fort Anne. George Street is this street down here. So Fort Mohawk would have been around here. Not the same fortification. Lower George Street. Camp Aldershot, Land Force Atlantic Area Training Base. Land Force Atlantic Area Training Center, Aldershot. From the 1890s to the present, near Kentville. During the 1890s and the lead up to the Boer War in South Africa, the British Army, which was responsible for Canada's defense until 1906, established a training center, a training area for Canadian militia units in the western part of Kings County, between the communities of Aylesford and Kingston. In 1904, the facility was moved to its present site on 1,136 hectares, or 2,810 acres, northwest of Kentville, with a southern boundary along the Cornwallis River. The eastern boundary of the camp abutted the Cornwallis Valley Railway, which operated north from Kentville to Kingsport. The Canadian Department of Militia and Defence took over administration of the facility from the British Army in 1906. Used almost exclusively as a militia facility from its inception, various units of cavalry, infantry, and artillery from across Nova Scotia received training here. Few permanent structures were established in the early years, with the troops being required to erect canvas tents during training and to stable horses in the open. Camp Aldershot saw extensive use during the First World War, with in excess of 7,000 soldiers being trained for the infantry at any particular time. So train another 7,000, then off they go, train another 7,000, then off they go throughout that war. Temporary buildings were constructed to house messes and cookhouses, as well as a camp hospital. However, most soldiers training at Camp Aldershot during this time period were housed in canvas tents. Temporary structures were removed following the armistice in 1918, and the camp reverted to its previous use as a militia training facility, seeing very light use throughout the interwar period when Canada's military underwent extensive downsizing. The camp underwent significant expansion during the Second World War, with numerous new buildings constructed between 1939 and 1943. Only a single building from the First World War was retained, while water and sewer systems were installed in the camp's headquarters area. Firing ranges and parade squares, the large and small parade squares, established, and various support buildings and barracks. Despite the construction of the barracks, the huge influx of soldiers required the use of tents for housing, along with temporary cookhouses. Following the war, Camp Aldershot went into decline. However, its well-constructed Second World War era facilities were maintained during the tensions of the Cold War. In 1953, the Black Watch, Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, returned from service in the Korean War, and the 1st and 2nd Battalions were stationed at Camp Aldershot. From 1953 to 1959, Camp Aldershot saw significant use while housing this regular force unit. The Black Watch rotated to West Germany in 1959 and was stationed at the newly constructed Camp Gagetown in New Brunswick upon its return, delivering a significant blow to Camp Aldershot, which had no regular force units returning to fill the void. Camp Aldershot was left with the Canadian Army's reserve militia units from Nova Scotia as its primary users, primarily the West Nova Scotia Regiment. However, the Royal Canadian Army Cadets also used the camp for its summer camps. The late 1960s saw numerous changes to Canada's military during the turmoil surrounding the unification of the Canadian Forces. Camp Aldershot underwent more decline as facility rationalization throughout the military took place, and the Army Cadets established ACSTC Argonaut at CFB Gagetown. Rumors of the camp being declared surplus began during the early 1970s, when military activity was at an all-time low. Thus, the new Atlantic Militia Area of Force Mobile Command began to increase training of reservists at the newly designated Militia Training Center on the site in 1973. The use of the term Camp Aldershot was officially discontinued in lieu of Aldershot Range and Training Area. Training continued at ARTA through the 1970s and 1980s until the mid-1990s, when the camp was designated to become the host to the newly formed Land Force Atlantic Area Training Center, officially termed LFAA-TC Aldershot. Since then, the majority of the Second World War era buildings have been replaced by new construction, although the single First World War era structure that was maintained has been incorporated as the new officers' mess. Currently, LFAA-TC Aldershot provides the majority of training for Land Forces Atlantic Area Reserve units during the summer months, as well as a training area for Nova Scotia Reserve units through the remainder of the year. The Minas Stockade. (1746 to 1747), 1749 to 1753, and 1760 in Grand Pre. This is rather hard to see, but you'll find it's a very strange shape. Instead of the normal 4-point or star fort, this was a triangular stockade, and it was built around 3 deserted Acadian houses by British troops as a stopgap measure before winter set in. They arrived too late for time to build a proper fort. The blockhouse from Annapolis Royal, which was Fort Mohawk, was then erected here in 1749. The garrison transferred to Fort Edward in 1753. Blockhouse was rebuilt in 1760 and renamed Fort Montague. The old village stockade was also known as Fort vos logis. A French fort may have earlier been located east of here, at the mouth of the Gaspereau River. This is where the fort was. It's now a cow pasture. This is what it looked like when it was Fort Montague in 1760. The Planters Barracks from 1778 to 1782 at Stars Point. A local militia two-story barracks built to protect the town against American privateers during the American Revolution. Sold here in 1782 and therefore used as a private residence. Restored in 1992 and operated as a historic country inn, but now again a private residence. It's located at 1464 Stars Point Road. This was the garrison of the fort at the time. These fellows were the King's Orange Rangers. They were not British. They were actually from Massachusetts. And they were also located in Fort Morris and Liverpool, Nova Scotia. They were active from 1776 to 1783, and they were dragoons and light infantry. The commanders were Sir William Howe and Brigadier General Henry Edward Fox. They were around during the American Revolutionary War. They were stationed here at the Planters Barracks because the planters, the local area people that arrived there in 1760 following the expulsion of the Acadians, were rumored to want to raise the Liberty pole. In other words, rebel and become part of the American Revolutionary War on the side of the Americans. This garrison would march up and down what is now called Church Street to intimidate the local populace to quiet down and calm down. And it worked. This is a plaque to one of the commanders of the King's Orange Rangers. It's located in Middleton, Nova Scotia. This is a plaque to the New England planters of Cornwallis. This is at Stars Point, at what you might call Town Plot in Port Williams. What the plaque says is, following the expulsion of the Acadians in 1755, this fertile area lay empty. In response to recruiting from New England settlers known as planters, settled on this site in 1760. More information on that, I recommend visiting Town Plot. This is another plaque which is found at Grand Pre at the battle at the site of the Battle of Grand Pre. I'll read what that says. It's more clear to see. New England planters. In 1759, New England farmers and fishermen sent agents to Halifax to discuss with Governor Lawrence the settlement of the undeveloped areas of the province. Substantial immigration began in 1760, and by late 1763, several thousand settlers were established throughout Nova Scotia. They were particularly successful in the Minas area, where they took up the fallow lands of the displaced Acadians. By 1780, Edmund Burke could describe the province as formed by the overflowings of the exuberant population of New England. This influx was to have a significant effect on the character and development of Nova Scotia. As you can see, during this time, there was a cluster of fortifications here. Now let's see what Wikipedia has to say about Fort Hughes. Fort Hughes, Nova Scotia, also known as Planters Barracks, was a fortification that was built at present-day Stars Point, Nova Scotia, during the American Revolution to protect against raids by American privateers. The fortification was named after the governor of Nova Scotia, Sir Richard Hughes, 2nd Baronet, who had the fortification built on a piece of land belonging to Samuel Starr, a planter from Norwich, Connecticut, and militia officer. 3 months after a privateer raid on the Cornwallis River, the barracks was built in 1778 beside the militia parade ground at Stars Point. 56 troops were stationed there. The King's Orange Rangers were stationed at the fortification during the Revolution. The Rangers were sent to the area in part to ensure that the planters remained loyal to the King, marching up and down what is now known as Church Street. In the spring of 1781, Major Samuel Bayard led the King's Orange Rangers from Halifax to Fort Hughes to overawe the local planters who were planning to erect a liberty pole and thereby break with the King. There they fixed bayonets, and with bright weapons glittering, colors flying, and drums beating, they marched up Church Street and back to Town Plot, where the barracks stood. This show of force brought the locals back in line. Bayard took an interest in the Annapolis Valley, and after the war, he took up a grant of 4,730 acres at Wilmot Mountain. Fort Hughes was one of a chain of fortifications that created a courier route that started from Citadel Hill at Halifax, Nova Scotia, to Fort Edward, Nova Scotia, then Fort Hughes, then Fort Anne at Annapolis Royal, and then to Fort Howe at St. John, New Brunswick, and then onward to Quebec. Once again, this monument is to Samuel Bayard. At the King's Orange Rangers Middleton Park in Middleton, Nova Scotia, Canada. This building survives today as one of the oldest in Nova Scotia. In 2016, archaeologist Aaron Taylor found rich artifacts on the property from the American Revolution time period. Jack Marriott, the customs broker in Port Williams, lived here from 1928 and 1988, when he was 100 years old, until it became an inn. Cornwallis Fort. Kentville, Nova Scotia, had a fort. This is what the area looked like in 1848. The fort is obviously already gone, but it was here, on this headland. From 1760, Kentville. There was a palisaded British fort with 4 guns. Remains are still visible until 1850. This is 1848. Kentville was originally named Cornwallis, and there's Cornwallis River. Fort at New Minas, 1740s in New Minas. This was probably an Acadian stone house that was referred to as a fort by the British settlers in 1760. It was not really a fort, it was a stone house, which during the Battle of Grand Pre was more or less the same thing. Falmouth Fort, 1760 in Falmouth. A British fort or blockhouse was probably built here. Fort Edward, National Historic Site, 1750 to 1850, and from 1915 to 1918, Windsor, Nova Scotia. This is the oldest surviving wooden military blockhouse in Canada, and possibly in all of North America. These buildings were around at 1900. They're no longer there. Some traces of the earthworks are still visible. Actually, they are quite visible if you go there. Here's a better look at it during the time of Father Le Loutre's War. It was also actively garrisoned during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, also known as Pisgwood Post and also West Point Blockhouse. The fortifications gradually fell into disrepair, but the grounds were continued to be used by the local militia for training as well as for the site of the Windsor Agricultural Fair. During World War I, the fort grounds also served as a muster camp and training depot for troops from the Annapolis Valley waiting to go overseas, which was popularly known as Camp Fort Edward. The 1812 era officers' quarters, once again, here, this building, burned down in 1922. The Nova Scotia colonial government in 1760 tried to establish here a centralized trade post or factory under military control to regulate the region's fur trade. This area's grounds next to it is now houses the garrison or the armories for B Company of the West Nova Scotia Regiment. Fort Ellis, 1761, in Stewiacke. Fort Ellis. Where the heck is that? Here is Truro. Here by Stewiacke, at the junction of the river, was Fort Ellis. Here is a map showing Fort Ellis, as it was a star fort at the junction of the rivers, and nearby was a good timber harvesting area. There's Fort Ellis. We'll see what Wikipedia has to say about Fort Ellis. Fort Ellis was a British fort or blockhouse built during the French and Indian War, located at the junction of the Shubenacadie and Stewiacke rivers, close to Stewiacke, Nova Scotia, Canada. The location was labeled Ville Pierre Hébert by Charles Morris. The 14 Acadian families in the area vacated with the Acadian Exodus. Charles Morris recommended a fort on the Shubenacadie River in 1753. Governor Lawrence first considered the fort in 1754 as a means to protect Halifax from Mi'kmaq raids. Lawrence decided the fort would not be effective until the Battle of Fort Beausejour. The fort was completed on October 18, 1761, shortly after the Halifax treaties were signed. The fort was to guard the new road built to connect Truro and Halifax against Mi'kmaq raids. The fort was called Fort Ellis after Governor Henry Ellis, who was appointed the governor weeks after the fort's completion. The fort was never garrisoned and eventually abandoned in 1767. Fort Belcher, named after Governor Jonathan Belcher, was built on the Salmon River in Lower Onslow, Nova Scotia, in 1761 to 1767. Fort Franklin was built at Tatamagouche in 1768, named after Michael Franklin, and lasted only a year. Fort Morris, Nova Scotia, was named after Charles Morris. So, Stewiacke had a fort, Fort Ellis, and near Truro was Fort Belcher. Here is a better look at the location of Fort Belcher. Here's Fort Belcher. And here is Lower Onslow, and nearby is the Burt. The Parsborough Blockhouse, 1812 to 1815, in Parsborough. Where is Parsborough? Parsborough is here along this shore. The Bay of Fundy here would be Kentville. The Parsborough shore is here, and here is Parsborough here, directly across the water from where the Planters Barracks, Kentville, and other locations are. In 1812 to 1815, Parsborough, there were two wooden British blockhouses with barracks that protected the small harbour on a hill overlooking Partridge Island. A gunboat protected the early ferry crossing. One of the blockhouses reportedly still had visible remains until well into the 20th century. Fort Beaubassin, 1672 to 1750, near Amherst. Okay. Beaubassin actually refers to the whole area. Fort Beaubassin, by some accounts, is somewhere along here along the shore, but excavations have been also nearby Fort Beausejour. A fortified French settlement of initially 5 families from Port Royal. The village was evacuated in 1750 for Beausejour, Fort Beausejour, New Brunswick, under British pressure to relocate. So they were here, but they moved to Fort Beausejour. This is where the location is now with a large sign. This is what the excavation site looks like for Beaubassin. Fort Lawrence, National Historic Site, 1750 to 1756, once again near Amherst. This is what it looks like now. This flag is inappropriate because it was never an Acadian fort. Built by the British adjacent to the then abandoned Acadian village Beaubassin to keep the French in Acadia, New Brunswick, from crossing into British territory. There were 2 blockhouses within the square palisade. After the capture of Fort Beausejour, New Brunswick in June 1755, the British burned down Fort Lawrence in September 1756 when it was no longer needed. A stone cairn near the present railroad marks the location, adjacent to a dairy farm. Earthworks are still visible until 1991. Here would be, as a sign says, going this way to Fort Lawrence, and this was Fort Beausejour. So the Beaubassin guys left here and went there. This is the cairn, again, which marks where Fort Lawrence was. Here is a better way to look at the location. Here is Fort Beausejour, and here is Fort Lawrence, looking across from each other. They even had a deal for a while of exchanging each other's deserters. When one side deserted to the other, they would be captured and sent back. The Chignecto Post, near Amherst in 1760. The Nova Scotia colonial government tried to establish a centralized trade post or factory under military control to regulate the region's fur trade. Fort Grunt. This was at Cape Spencer. It has an unknown date. This name appears on several old maps. There's no further data, but there was a fort here. World War II air defense radar stations. 1942 to 1945, there were various locations. The Royal Canadian Air Force, North Atlantic Region, RCAF Group 1, operated several air defense radar stations, employing the chain home low early warning radar. Initially, the stations were called radio detachments, and in 1943, the title radio unit was adopted. The term radar was not adopted by Canadians until late 1943. The chain ceased operations with the war's end in mid-1945. The RCAF radar sites were located at Tusket Island, Brooklyn, Queens County, and Preston, Port Dufferin, Queensport, Louisbourg, and Bell Lake in Dartmouth. Also of interest, located north of Halifax in Debert, is the former Camp Debert Regional Emergency Government Headquarters bunker, Nova Scotia's Deaford bunker. Built in 1961 to 64 to house up to 350 Nova Scotia government officials during a nuclear war or other major crisis. It was decommissioned in 1998, sold in 2008, and sold again in 2012 to a private developer. This ends the first part of fortifications in Nova Scotia.